be sure to check out Jaguar Gator 8 today, where an all-new video on college football history drops today at 6 p.m. Eastern. Click the card in the upper right corner now to join the channel. And now, on with our feature presentation. One of the worst feelings in the world is when you go against your gut instinct. You second-guess yourself, and then you pay the price because of it. You put your money on red in roulette, then switch it over to black at the last minute, and sure enough, it lands on red. You originally fill out a bracket that had Team A winning the game, but you overthink it and change your mind and switch it to Team B. And then, sure enough, Team A wins. You're driving to work, and you have two options with what highway to take. So you plan on taking one highway, and then decide to change course and go on the other highway. And sure enough, that second highway has traffic, while the first one was smooth sailing the whole way through. You get the idea. You're faced with a difficult decision. You go with your gut. Then you change your mind and flip to something else. And as it turns out, your gut was right the whole time, and the added information you got hurt you. Well, a scenario like that is sort of what happened to NBC back in 1968 with its coverage of the American Football League and this game right here. Yes, it's another story on NBC getting involved in some sort of broadcasting controversy that season, because we don't have enough of those on this channel. We have the catastrophe at the start of the season regarding the Monday night telecast between the Kansas City Chiefs and the Houston Oilers, which ticked off Johnny Carson so much that he refused to do his show as a result. You can learn more about that by clicking the card in the upper right corner. We have the Heidi game between the New York Jets and the Oakland Raiders, which, let's be honest, needs no introduction at this point and no further comments. You can learn more about that by clicking the card in the upper right corner. And now, we have this. Because during Week 7 of the 1968 season, NBC decided, at the last minute, to change their mind with what game to nationally broadcast. And while you might not necessarily be able to fault them for the decision, the end result did not work out in their favor at all. Because this is the story behind one of the worst broadcasting decisions ever made by NBC when it came to their decade-long coverage of the American Football League. Before I talk about the actual plan in question and what NBC decided to change to, we need some context to understand the events that led up to the decision, as well as what the original plan was. Back in 1968, NBC had a national doubleheader for all of its AFL games, meaning that they were guaranteed to show a game in the 1:30 window and in the 4 o'clock window, no matter what. And the same thing held true for Week 7 of the season, held on October 20th. Now, in the early window, it was really a matter of picking your poison, because neither game was particularly appealing. You either had the AFL East battle between the 2-3 Boston Patriots and the 1-4-1 Buffalo Bills, or the Expansion Bowl between the 1-3-1 Miami Dolphins and the 2-4 Cincinnati Bengals. You're kinda screwed either way with that one. And for what it's worth, NBC went with the Boston-Buffalo game, which makes sense. But at 4 o'clock, they had 3 games to choose from. One of them was the battle between the 4-1 San Diego Chargers and the 2-3 Denver Broncos, which, even though it might have been a decent game on paper, wasn't ever a serious option for NBC. So in reality, it was down to 2 games. And initially, the plan was to air the game that you've been watching this whole time, which was a pivotal AFL East battle between the New York Jets and the Houston Oilers. This was going to be the national game aired across the entire country, and across the entire East Coast, and it made complete sense as to why this was going to be the game with Kurt Gowdy and company on the call. In one corner, you had the 3-2 New York Jets, currently sitting in first place in their division, who had the biggest star not just in the AFL, but in all of professional football in quarterback Joe Namath, who was really the first quarterback ever to transcend being a football player and enter the world of pop culture stardom, where everyone knew who he was. They had the 3rd best offense in football, and were looking like one of the favorites to make it to the Super Bowl, especially since Namath had back-to-back seasons before this, where he led the entire league in passing yards, and during certain games to start the year off, he was showing no signs of slowing down whatsoever. And in the other corner, you had the Houston Oilers, who were one win back of the Jets for first place in the division, at a time where only the division winner made it to the playoffs. Even though things had been unusually rough for the Oilers to start the season off, they were coming off of a nice 16-0 shutout win against the Patriots. Plus, despite their struggles, they still had a defense and an offense that was in the top half of the league, which no other team in the division could say. On top of that, aside from the fact that this game could possibly determine first place in the division, these were two teams that absolutely despised each other, especially after 1967, when the Oilers won the division by one game in a highly controversial manner, where the Jets protested the outcome. You can learn more about that bizarre controversy by clicking the card in the upper right corner. There was some bad blood to settle in this battle, let's put it that way. However, there was one thing that was scaring off NBC, even though they announced this as the national game. And that was the fact that the previous week, in this game right here, well, let's just say that the Jets, and the Golden Boy in particular, did not look good. In a home game against the Denver Broncos, in which the Jets were a whopping 19-point favorite to win, somehow, the Jets lost, making it one of the biggest upsets in professional football history in terms of the spread. And while you can pinpoint a ton of reasons as to why they lost this game, at the end of the day, the blame has to fall on the shoulders of Joe Namath, who completed less than 50% of his passes, threw no touchdowns, and threw an astonishingly high 5 interceptions, finishing the game with a passer rating of 37.8, which is worse than if he did nothing but spiked the ball into the ground on every single play. Namath was definitely solid at times throughout the season, but this was one of the worst and ugliest games of his career, as his play against the Broncos was downright embarrassing. And that's when NBC, at the very last minute, decided to call an audible. NBC got scared. Even though this was a battle, for all intents and purposes, for first place in the AFL East, as the Oilers could tie the Jets to the top of the wins column, even though this was a game involving Joe Namath, even though this was a game with a New York media market, which could see this game since it was taking place in Houston, and even though the bad blood between these teams was at an all-time high, NBC changed its mind. Again, it would be one thing if this was a bad game on paper. It'd be one thing if these teams had one win apiece and were playing terrible football and were playing for nothing. But that was not the case at all. It's almost like today, if you flexed out a battle between two teams sitting at 9-5, even if there are better games that might be on, it's something that you just don't do. It's too much of a logistical nightmare. And yet, NBC was so scared of the Jets' performance against the Broncos that they decided to take this game off from a national game to a regional game. Even though the irony in all of this is that you would think it would be the opposite, if anything, since this game had way more meaning now that the Jets lost versus if the Jets won, since if they won, they'd be 2.5 games up. Which raises the question, what game did they decide to air nationally instead? To be fair to NBC, the option that they had at their disposal was awfully tempting. Out was the battle for the AFL East, and in was the battle for the AFL West. Because now, in the national 4 o'clock slot, for the whole country to see, you had the Kansas City Chiefs taking on the Oakland Raiders in this game right here. You had a battle between the top 2 teams in the league, with the Chiefs sitting at 5-1 and the Raiders sitting at 4-1. You had a battle between the teams with the top 2 point differentials in the league, with the Chiefs in first at plus 102 and the Raiders in second at plus 99. You had a battle between the teams with the top 2 offenses in the league in terms of points scored, with the Chiefs in second with 158 points and the Raiders in first with 174 points, or 34.8 points per game. It was the number 1 offense in Oakland against the number 1 defense in Kansas City, which had only allowed 56 points through 6 games, or 9.3 points per game. And most importantly, it was a battle for first place in the division. Safe to say, There was a ton on the line here, to the point that NBC, despite initially scheduling Jets-Oilers, not even a few days before the game, switched it to Chiefs-Raiders. And back in 1968, this was chaotic, because the announcing teams did not change. Despite Jets-Oilers now being a regional game, Kirk Gowdy, the main play-by-play guy, was still on the call. Despite Raiders-Chiefs now being a national game, Jim Simpson, arguably the number 3 broadcaster, was still on the call. It's almost like if Andrew Catalon called the national game for CBS instead of Jim Nantz. NBC was taking a massive gamble here, because again, they weren't replacing a bad game with a good game. They were replacing a very good game that more of the country was probably interested in, since it involved Joe Namath and New York, with another very good, maybe slightly better game, but with an inferior production crew and on-air talent crew to go along with it. It was a classic case of the grass is always greener on the other side. In other words, this is like if the Cowboys and Eagles were 8-6 going into Week 16, and that was the Sunday night game, and they took that off the air to air a game between two 10-4 teams. It was bizarre. It was unconventional. It was widely criticized. But did it work? Well, here's the funny thing. There's something to be said about trusting your gut and sticking with your first reaction, because it was probably right for a reason. And man, did NBC learn that lesson here the hard way. Starting with the Chiefs-Raiders game they've been watching this whole time, yeah, this one was a bit of a snoozer. The Chiefs won this one 24-10, never trailed at any time, and in reality, the game was never even that close, seeing as the Chiefs led it 24-0 midway through the third quarter, and led it 17-0 at the half. On top of that, this game was the true definition of 3 yards in a cloud of dust, as this game took football back a solid 30 years, because Kansas City won it with the T formation while throwing 3 passes. Seriously, Len Dawson went 2 for 3 with 16 yards passing, with a 12-yard pass to Fred Urbanus and a 4-yard pass to Mike Garrett. That was it. It was that kind of day. I guess if you were a Chiefs fan, you enjoyed this one, and you enjoyed getting to stick it to your rival by extending your lead on first place in the division. For everyone else, for the national TV audience, not so much. As for Jets-Oilers, as in the game taking place at the same time, but originally scheduled for the national window, holy cow, what a game this was. This one was more like it. After the Jets led it 13-0 in the fourth quarter, the Oilers came roaring back to score 14 straight points, leading at 14-13 with 4 minutes left in the contest. That's when Joe Namath, in all his brilliance, engineered an 80-yard drive that culminated in a 2-yard touchdown run with just 46 seconds left, which gave the Jets an all-important 20-14 victory and helped maintain their hold on first place in the division. It was a thrilling, down-to-the-wire affair, and would have made for a fun national contest. Because let's see, which was better? A game where one team threw 3 passes and led by 24 points in the second half, or a game that was back and forth that was won on a game-winning touchdown with under a minute left? I think you know the answer to that question. On one hand, it's tough to necessarily fault NBC for making this last-minute switch, seeing as Chiefs-Raiders was a battle between arguably the top 2 teams in the league at the time. On the other hand, it's tough to not fault NBC for flipping out of a very good game on paper to show what they thought would be a better game, and then having that decision backfire on them in rather spectacular fashion. There's flex scheduling that's done out of necessity with the purpose of putting on a game that means something. And then there's flex scheduling that's done out of greed and pushing your luck. And this was a case of the latter. Because on October 20th, 1968, NBC learned that the grass isn't necessarily greener on the other side of the fence. Get your official Jaguar Gear 9 merchandise by going to jj9shop.com, and be sure to like and subscribe, as it really helps the channel out a lot. Join me every Wednesday night where we'll play NFL trivia for cash prizes at 9 p.m. Eastern over on Twitch. To learn more about the history of college football, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To learn more about the history of Major League Baseball, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 7. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.